Let's talk about that local angle. So obviously, Mayor Bloomberg and Commissioner Kelly came under a lot of criticism for their approach to policing terrorism. The demographics unit, which I think was renamed the zone assessment
the
unit,
zone assessment, right.
and then was shut down by de Blasio was one thing. There was the scrutinizing of political protesters before the RNC in 2004. So there was the sense that things had changed when de Blasio became mayor. How accurate is that sense? I know you've done some reporting about some infiltration of student groups that suggests that not much changed.
Yeah, I mean, the story I wrote focused on one undercover NYPD detective who began spying on Muslim students at Brooklyn College before de Blasio was elected and continued well through past his term in office after he was sworn into office. I mean, I think another thing in the demographics unit, as far as I understand, they never had undercover cops infiltrating Muslim communities. Obviously, they mapped communities, which is a horrible thing in and of itself, I think, but they weren't infiltrating communities. And there's been, even when Bratton talks about the dismantling of the demographics unit, if you look at what he says, he's basically there were 3 guys working in there, we weren't even doing anything.
Right.
It wasn't even that useful anymore.
Right. They created a good guy to the best restaurants in town, but that was about it.
Right. Yeah, all of their powers have been basically already folded into other units. So I think, for me, the story that I wrote really was a reason it was important was to track the continuities between Kelly and what's happening now, in that many Muslims still believe that things haven't changed.
Right, because you live in Bay Ridge, where there was a tremendous amount of informants and infiltration of mosques and others. Has the feeling there, I got the sense 5 years ago that people felt like they were being watched and they couldn't trust their neighbors. Has that abated at all?
I'm sure it depends who you ask, but I think for the people I've spoken to, I don't think that feeling has changed. And I don't think that, I think de Blasio spoke a lot about the importance of shutting down the demographics unit, but it doesn't seem to me that his administration has done much to assuage community fears that undercover spying or surveillance has truly ended.
So in full disclosure, I had a brief stint where I worked as a speechwriter in the de Blasio administration, very briefly. I crossed over to the dark side, into politics, and then I was like, you know what, this is not for me. I need to come back to the journalism side. So I wasn't in these high-level meetings, obviously. I was a speechwriter, but that being said, I totally agree with you. I feel like, certain verbiage and language and names may be changed or programs may be supposedly eliminated, but at the end of the day, they're just folded into other things and still continuing. And then with de Blasio, what I also noticed, the lawsuit that some folks had filed against NYPD, he basically held the same line as Bloomberg, where he never denounced their actions. He just basically pushed back against this lawsuit. So it's what really truly has changed? You might change the name of something, but actual policy is still pretty much the same.
Right, he's still defending the position Bloomberg had. And de Blasio himself was all over the map before being elected on the question of the surveillance program. He was for it, then he was against it, then he was... So he's been... And I think the local conversation mirrors the national one. Mere hours after the attacks, John Brennan, the national security advisor, said that this was a repudiation of the kind of post-Snowden reforms.
It's interesting you pointed out, because I also noticed with Judith Miller, she also tweeted something that very same day. We know Judith Miller, New York Times, helping to sell us the Iraq war that got us into this mess, that actually destabilized the region, created ISIS, and she tweeted something to the effect of, maybe now the students that have been protesting on campuses have something else, can stop whining about safe spaces and can talk about something else. And I'm like, wow, the audacity to tweet something like that is just amazing. People's reactions have just been all over the place, and I think very irresponsible and just too much hysteria across the board.
And the crazy thing is that the reforms that Brennan is criticizing were remarkably modest. I mean, they still can do a lot of stuff. There is some bulk collection of data that they are prohibited from doing based on this USA Freedom Act, right? I mean, he's complaining about a very, very modest sort of rolling back of his powers.
Yeah, definitely. I think also the notion that people who've decided to engage in acts of terrorism the notion that in any context they would believe that they weren't under surveillance of some kind, and that Siddon's revelations somehow changed the entire landscape of like the kinds of policing or surveillance they believe they were under, is just like, it's just a ludicrous idea, right? Snowden's revelations were important because like vast majority of Americans realized that they could potentially be under surveillance. That's something that Muslims have known about for a long time, and certainly people actively engaged in acts of terrorism I presume they've always known that they were being spied on.
And I know you're working on some stories about Islamophobia, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I think about a lot, but I think another thing that's important to recognize is the ways that, you know, Islamophobia and the militarization of the NYPD is also affecting all communities of color in New York, right? So I think one thing that they talked about a lot in the news coverage this week was how the NYPD has created, increased the militarization or like the weaponization of their units, kind of partially as a result of Charlie Hebdo and anticipating that there would be kind of multi-pronged attack on cities, and that was it the strategic response group? Do you remember if that was the name?
That sounded like the kind of name they would have for something like that.
Right?
Yeah, and I think they said they've tripled the amount of officers who were carrying semi-automatic weapons, right, just in their cars. And so I was following the coverage from the demonstration yesterday, the anniversary of Tamir Rice's killing, you know, this kid in Ohio who was killed by a cop. And there were NYPD cops with semi-automatic weapons strapped around themselves at the Barclays Center, just with protesters there.
I saw that, yeah.
So I think that's all, you know, it's also really important for us to think about the ways that the war on terror and the militarization of the police is affecting, like, you know, movements against police brutality in all forms, right?